I do not attend celebrations of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. Seeing the very officials who would gladly rush forth to drive the first nail in his re-crucifixion, spouting platitudes of racial understanding, are too much even for the strongest stomach to tolerate. The king whom they have sanitized for our protection is not the man I remember or wish to celebrate. I had the exceptional privilege to cover Martin Luther King Jr. as an electronic journalist during the larger part of 1966 when he was in Chicago leading and organizing the Poor People's Campaign for Human Rights. I was in close contact with Dr. King in my coverage of his activities. The late 60s were fraught. Fraught is the right word. The society was in nearly as much chaos as today. The difference is that unlike the anesthetized present, back then the issues were clearer. We were not distracted by as much media duplicity and false news. We were intensely aware of the social and political dissonance that stood out in high relief. Nevertheless, the black movement was hardly united. There was a whole spectrum of competing strategies, analyses, and perceptions, ranging from the Black Panthers at one end to the NAACP at the other. I witnessed King beset on all sides by activists attempting to pull him in multiple directions. He was also struggling against Mayor Daley and his patronage machine that kept our Negroes, in quotation marks, in comfortable cages. The black pro-Mayor Daley voices were represented by Representative William Dawson, the black overlord of the South Side. There was a power struggle between the SCLC and the Black Panthers. The Nation of Islam, or black Muslims, preached isolation, while conservative northern blacks preached gradualism. Even the NAACP viewed King's demands for fair housing and other playing field levelers for black folks as threatening the sometimes tenuous establishment they had accommodated for themselves. Not least of all was incipient northern racism. In the southern campaigns, there were a few hundred, and often only a dozen or so, KKK and white supremacists to counter-protest. In the open housing march through Cicero, Illinois, where King was hit with a rock, there were thousands. It was a racism that was present but denied by the conservative and midstream Democrats at the time. It didn't take King's dealing with Mayor Daley very long before I heard him say he would rather deal with Southerner Bull Connor than with Mayor Daley. There was no love lost on Daley's part either. Boy, I could tell you stories. 1968 was a watershed year for me personally as well as for the nation. There were literally dozens of earth-shattering events occurring every week. We seemed to be reeling from one horrific event or revelation to the next. It would take me my allotted 6 minutes here to even list them all. Most notable for my emerging consciousness was the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis in April and the Chicago Democratic National Convention in August 1968. What then have I derived from my association with Dr. King and my experiences of having been chased out of Lincoln Park by Chicago's finest during those fateful days during the Democratic National Convention? At the time of King's assassination in Memphis, the tensions between President Johnson and Dr. King over the Vietnam War had become outright hostility. Later it was determined in a law court that the federal government had a more active responsibility in the assassination. Like Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray was nothing more than a patsy. Most Americans no longer believe Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy. Most erroneously still believe that James Earl Ray shot King. At the time of his execution, Dr. King's insistence on equating the triple pestilences of racism, poverty, and war had arguably made him the most hated man in America. Even the blacks in his own movement opposed his unpatriotic pronouncements. Black leadership did not want to hear a critique of the president who had signed the Voting Rights Act. Liberals did not want to be thought of as supporting a genocidal war in Vietnam, and the North did not want to think of themselves as more racist than the South. Since those days, the United States has done its damnedest to deny King's axiom that the arc of history bends towards justice. As we continue our inexorable slide towards oligarchy and fascism, I will always look back on those days being in the physical presence of a remarkable man of peace. I will always remember King as the greatest redeemer of our age. In his life, and more importantly in his execution, Dr. King taught me the only freedom lies in the resistance to illegitimate authority, and redemption is only possible through revolt. I do not resist, and I do not work to destroy fascism in the country King called the greatest purveyor of violence, because I think I will win, but because it is fascism. Chris Hedges best embodies the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. in today's world. Speaking of another of my heroes, Albert Camus, he said, Camus argued that we are separated from each other. Our lives are meaningless. We cannot influence fate. We will all die and our individual being will be obliterated. And yet Camus wrote that one of the only coherent philosophical positions is revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his obscurity. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate, without the resignation that ought to accompany it.